This week on Inside Scoop, can Virginia stay red? Who really speaks for Hispanic American voters and keeping prices and the narrative under control? Welcome to Inside Scoop, where we talk about all the news that's fit to print in the Washington Examiner magazine. I'm Jim Antle, your host, and this week we're talking about a story from our national political correspondent Mabinti Qureshi on the Virginia governor's race. The Virginia and New Jersey governor's races are often a preview as to what the following year's midterm elections will look like. In 1993, when George Allen won the governorship, and in 2009, when Bob McDonnell won the governorship, that was a preview for good years ahead for Republicans in the midterm elections. 4 years ago, Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, had a big win in Virginia.
This stopped being a campaign long ago. This is the spirit of Virginia coming together like never before. The spirit of Washington and Jefferson and Madison and Monroe and Patrick Henry, of Virginians standing up and taking our Commonwealth back.
Can Republicans sustain this momentum in a state that had been becoming increasingly blue? This year, the Republican gubernatorial nominee is Virginia Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earle-Sears, and her poll numbers thus far have not been quite as encouraging.
The polls are telling us, and the people are telling us, that they want what we're doing to continue. And this is where I believe my opponent, Abigail Spanberger, is going to get tripped up, because the people like what we've done.
The Democratic candidate is former Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, and one of the things that she's running very heavily on are the DOGE cuts to the federal workforce, a very big voting bloc in crucial northern Virginia.
Voters across Virginia know that the choice is a clear one between a governor who will stand up for Virginians and Virginia's economy, particularly under these unprecedented attacks on the federal workforce. 320,000 Virginians are federal employees. Our larger economy, certainly the impacts of those firings ripple across communities across our Commonwealth.
Youngkin 4 years ago beat Terry McAuliffe, a former governor who had difficulty distancing himself from the national Democratic brand. This time around, Spanberger is trying to position herself as a centrist.
Everything that Abigail Spanberger does to claim she's a moderate, she's lying. And she overall has an extremist voting record. When you look at her time in Congress, she had only a 5% voting record according to Heritage Action. She voted against the Lake and Riley Act, which would protect and make sure that illegal aliens are being deported, people who are committing violent crimes. When you're talking about economics, she did all of the bills that Joe Biden wanted that increased inflation, that was so painful for families in Virginia and all over the country. You had record inflation under Joe Biden, 20% cumulative, hadn't been seen in a generation, and Abigail Spanberger was all for that.
Can Republicans tie Spanberger to the Democratic brand nationally and to an unpopular Democratic administration from just last year? Can they sustain the momentum that was started by Glenn Youngkin in turning Virginia red in all of the statewide offices held by Republicans? And if they can, what will that mean for next year's midterm elections? What do you think? Comment down below. This week, I'm joined by Washington Examiner senior writer David Harsanyi, who wrote the cover story for this issue, which is about whether the pro-ICE protesters really speak for Hispanic Americans. David, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So, David, when you wrote this piece, walk us through a little bit about the fact that many of these activists purport to be speaking for Hispanic voters more broadly, but there's increasing evidence that they're not really that representative.
Well, and I should preface this by saying I don't claim to speak for Hispanic people either. I am not Hispanic, but I do know that polling and empirical evidence and economic evidence and political evidence show that Latino American citizens who are here legally are headed in a different direction than ICE. I'm not even saying they're close ideologically, but even more conservative than the average Latino was maybe 10 years ago, or Hispanic. So it's clear to me that they're becoming more conservative, not less. And a lot of people claim that they're drifting towards conservatism, but I think it's probably just as much that Democrats are drifting towards where the ICE protesters were and the sort of Antifa, pro-Palestine, all the BLM, all the sort of trendy, progressive movements of the past few years.
And isn't part of it that Democrats seem to have tried to appeal to this voting bloc? One is if it's a very monolithic voting bloc, which it's not. And two, increasingly and maybe exclusively only using the immigration issue.
Yeah, and I'm happy you mentioned that. Obviously, when we say Latino American, we're talking about an incredibly diverse group, maybe more diverse than any other minority group that exists. I mean, these people have immigrated here from all kinds of countries with all kinds of traditions that are sometimes even antagonistic towards each other in certain ways. Identity politics involved. And this has been how the left has cobbled together their coalition for a long time. The problem with that is, I think many people who follow legal avenues to come here, or I know this even from people I know and have met, and even my family, the people who go and jump through all the hoops, it's not easy to become a citizen, don't take kindly to people who just skip the line or just cross the border and do it themselves. So I think that it's a big miscalculation to believe that someone who's here legally is going to be open-minded or want to defend or want to give amnesty to someone who did it the wrong way.
There's also the whole question of assimilation, and there is a sort of anti-assimilationist ethic behind a lot of the anti-ICE protests and a lot of immigration activism, which may empirically not really be in the best interests, particularly economically, of Hispanic Americans.
Well, sure, it's very difficult to assimilate when you keep bringing or allow people or incentivize people to sort of go into a community where people are slowly assimilating to American life, and you bring in people who don't speak English, or you bring in people who are living in the shadows and all of that. It makes it more difficult. This is why there have been in the past we've had big groups come to America, but then they sort of filtered out into the country elsewhere, or they became Americans and assimilated. But when you have this one geographic area where you have the same sorts of people coming with the same language and all of that, it makes it much more difficult, even though I think they've done a better job than a lot of people realize. And but yes, and then there's the whole thing. I mean, the left doesn't want people to assimilate in the right way. They don't want to make Americans. In many ways, when you go to school these days or you listen to the left, America's the bad guy in all things. Now, I'm not saying that we should romanticize our past, but we should at least want people to understand the core values that we're supposed to have and aspire to. And I don't think that happens most of the time.
Thank you, David. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can read David's full story by clicking here on our digital magazine. Lowering prices was key to President Donald Trump's platform in winning the 2024 presidential election and returning to the White House. Our Sarah Bedford looks a little over 6 months in and finds that the record is mixed.
Starting on day one, we will end inflation and make America affordable again.
Since President Donald Trump has taken office, inflation is down sharply from the record 8% high during the administration of former President Joe Biden. Inflation, as measured by the Producer Price Index, declined by 0.3 of a percentage point to 2.3% for the year ending in June. But everyday costs continue to rise, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In May, prices were 2.4% higher than a year before. The Trump administration has attempted to control the narrative on prices. When prices ticked up in February, Trump blamed the Biden administration.
There is a period of transition because what we're doing is very big.
But once inflation began slowing down, Trump declared victory. The Federal Reserve's long-term goal is 2% annual inflation, which it believes will keep the economy growing and prices stable. There's still concern about long-term inflation. The New York Fed reports people expect inflation to rise about 3% by 2028 and another 2.6% by 2030. Economists believe tariff-related price shocks will eventually hit the entire country. Trump has a tendency to announce tariffs and then delay their implementation. It's not known how large the tariff price shocks will be. This atmosphere of uncertainty may explain why the Fed has not moved to lower interest rates to boost spending. The Fed has held its benchmark rate at 4.5% since December 2024 in what Chairman Jerome Powell called a, quote, holding pattern.
In effect, we went on hold when we saw the size of the tariffs and essentially all inflation forecasts for the United States went up materially as a consequence of the tariffs. So we didn't overreact. In fact, we didn't react at all. We're simply taking some time. As long as the U.S. economy is in solid shape, we think the prudent thing to do is to wait and learn more and see what those effects might be.
The president has demanded rates be lowered.
We should be 3 points lower. Each point is $360 billion. Can you imagine that? That's big numbers.
The Trump administration believes Powell ignored inflation and waited too long to raise interest rates in 2021. They now believe he's waiting too long to lower rates.
I think he does a terrible job. He's costing us a lot of money, and we fight through it. It's almost, the country's become so successful that it doesn't have a big impact, but it does hurt people wanting to get a mortgage. People want to buy a house.
Trump has made it clear he has no plans to renominate Powell for a new term as Fed chairman next year.
He should cut. A smart person would cut. You know, he leaves very soon, so it's like one of those things, but I'll miss him greatly.
There is some concern that the White House's comments infringe on the Fed's independence. However, it's not unusual for presidents to complain about interest rates. Back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Sarah. You can read that story and all the other articles we've discussed in today's episode in the Washington Examiner magazine. This has been your Inside Scoop. I'm Jim Antle, your host. We'll catch you next time.